One evening in November of 1972, a 68-year-old man named Demetrius Machoura hurried around his small room at a boarding house in Stoke-on-Trent, England, pouring salt all over the floor. And as he did this, he looked out the window and saw the fading daylight and knew he had to hurry. However, running around like this was really taxing, especially on his lungs, because for decades he had worked in this very dusty pottery factory and it had really taken a toll on him, so moving faster was really hard to do. But he really needed to push through the pain and the discomfort and finish what he was doing before it got dark out. Because when it got dark out, that's when the vampires came out. So Demetrius had immigrated from Poland about 25 years earlier. And in his home country, vampires were not just, lore, but actually they were a huge part of the culture and were often spoken about as being very real dangers that people should be scared of. And recently, Demetrius, despite now living in England, of course, he had begun hearing about a lot of vampire sightings here. A few years ago, he started noticing these news reports about a vampire that was living in London's Highgate Cemetery. And also around the same time he began seeing those reports, he also learned about these two girls who had been attacked by a vampire in the English countryside. And Demetrius, he just could not believe how people were just not that panicked about this. I mean, Demetrius was terrified. He had grown up being scared of vampires that obviously, played a role in his reaction to these sightings now in England. But still, he's thinking why aren't more people scared about this? But even more than that, when Demetrius would actually talk about, these vampire concerns that he had with people in England, he found most people thought it was fake. That they thought that, these news reports and, all that stuff, it was just made up. It was fake. And then they would kind of look at Demetrius as sort of like an idiot for thinking that was real. Come on, vampires aren't real. But to Demetrius, he just felt like, what? Those people who don't believe in this very real threat that obviously is getting worse here, those people, they're the idiots, not him. And so Demetrius, instead of, trying to defend his position or try to convince anyone to believe what he believed, he decided to just do what he had to do to protect himself. And he knew exactly what to do. So Demetrius, he had a whole routine of things he would do to protect himself from vampires when he was living in Poland, and mostly he had abandoned that routine when he came to England. But now, since these sightings, he had brought back that routine, and it was very extensive. He had added on to it, made it more elaborate, but it was something he now did every single night, because vampires only come out at night, and so that's when you need protection. So before Demetrius climbed in bed at night, he would pour salt all around the room. And he would also scatter fresh garlic cloves everywhere, since those were both very toxic to vampires. And then after that, he would go up to each of the crosses that he had on his wall to make sure they were properly secured, because crosses are known deterrents to vampires. And then typically, after checking all the crucifixes, he would go around and maybe do a little more salt, a few more garlic cloves, and then once everything was in place and secure, he would climb into bed. And the moment his head hit the pillow, he would feel his heart rate finally start to settle down, because he knew that, at least for this night, he would be safe. And so in November of 1972, Demetrius just continued every night doing his vampire protection procedure. And even though some people thought this was very strange and very paranoid of him because, vampires aren't real, right? Well, it wasn't hurting anyone. Demetrius felt better when he did it. It was just sort of his own thing, and so he just continued to do it, and it didn't cause any problems. Until November 24th of that year. So on that day, just before 10 p.m., Police Constable John Pye of the Stoke-on-Trent Police Department, he walked up to the entrance of Demetrius's boarding house. He was here to do a wellness check, because the landlady of this place had called the station to tell them that she hadn't seen one of her tenants, Demetrius Machoura, in about a week, and was starting to worry about him. So now Pye knocked on the front door, and a few seconds later, this older woman swung it open, and she introduced herself as the landlady, and then she let Pye inside and led him down a hallway and stopped in front of Demetrius's door. And so Pye knocked, and he called out to Demetrius, announcing that he was the police and he was just here to make sure he was okay. But there was no sound coming from inside the room. And then when Pye reached down and tried the handle, he found it was locked. And so after knocking a few more times and calling out and still not hearing anything from inside, Pye told the landlady to go ahead and step back because he was gonna knock this door down. So Pye, he leaned back and then rammed his shoulder against the door, and actually it swung open really quickly, and immediately Pye and the landlady were hit with this really strong smell of garlic that was coming out of the very dark room in front of them. And so Pye immediately yells into the room for Demetrius, but there's no response. And so Pye, he reaches in and tries to find a light switch, and he does, and he flips it on, but it wasn't working for some reason. So Pye, he pulled out his flashlight off his belt, he clicked it on, and then he walked into the room. And right away, Pye felt like this small, dark room was the most bizarre, creepy space he had ever been inside of. There was what appeared to be salt all over the floor. And there were also cloves of garlic, like everywhere, not just on the ground, but also up on windowsills. And then at some point, Pye swept his flashlight from the wall over to the bed in the back of this room. It's basically like a one-bedroom apartment. And he sees the bed, and he sees there was a definitive human-sized lump under the sheets. And so right away, he had a good sense of what it was. And so Pye, he walked across the floor, stepping on garlic and salt as he went. And when he reached the bed, he pulled back the sheets, and under the sheets was the very obviously dead body of Demetrius Machura. Pye heard the sound of the landlady, who had followed him inside by this point. She gasped because she's seeing, what's inside of her boarding house here. And at this point, even though Pye was very sure Demetrius was dead, just to be sure, he reached down and he felt for a pulse, but there was none. And also Demetrius's skin was very cold and very pale. However, despite how very obviously deceased Demetrius was, Pye looked around and couldn't really make sense of exactly how he had died. I mean, there was no denying that he was in a very strange location, but he couldn't really picture how the salt and the garlic and the crosses could have had anything to do with his death. Maybe it was just the insanity of a dying man who crawled into bed and he died in here or something, but it was like, there's no visible wounds, there's no blood anywhere, there's nothing. It's just this weird, creepy room this guy's in, and he's just dead under the sheets. It was just bizarre. But there was one thing about Demetrius that in Pye's mind was pretty disturbing. I mean, even more so than what he was already seeing. And that was that Demetrius, he had died with this terrified looking expression on his face. Like his mouth was wide open, like it was frozen as if he'd been screaming as he took his final breath, which made Demetrius wonder if maybe when he died, his death had been quite painful or just terrifying. Like maybe Demetrius had seen something, like as he died. Was he scared of something as he was dying that caused his face to sort of freeze in this expression? However, that made Pye think that maybe this was a homicide. That the victim, Demetrius, was scared of the attacker, and that's why he looked the way he did. The attacker is attacking him, and he's reacting. But Pye's looking at the body thinking, I don't think this was a homicide, because there's just no injury anywhere. So what would the attacker have done? How could they have forcibly killed Demetrius without leaving any marks anywhere? Now, Pye knew he was not going to get any real answers here without an autopsy. But while he was here, he could at least do a search of the room and also canvass the neighbors, starting with the landlady. So he turned to the visibly shocked landlady and asked her, hey, what's the deal with all the salt and the crosses and the garlic? What's that about? And surprisingly, she shrugged it off it was just no big deal. It's just what Demetrius did. And when Pye was like, what do you mean? She explained that Demetrius had a really serious phobia of vampires. And these were measures he took to protect himself from vampires. For a second, Pye just stared back at her, like he couldn't believe what he was being told. But then he was also thinking, all right, I'm looking around the room. This is already totally weird. So actually, in a way, that sort of tracks. However, Pye wasn't sure if Demetrius's apparent delusion around vampires really had anything to do with Demetrius's death or not, or if this is just a quirk of the case that this man died, however he died, and also was scared of vampires. He didn't know. But for now, Pye was just incredibly curious and absolutely determined to get answers. A little over a month later, Police Constable Pye was sitting at his desk in police headquarters reading a library book about vampires. So Demetrius's case was actually on pause while Pi waited for the autopsy results. But even though he really couldn't do much until those results came in, Pi himself just couldn't stop thinking about Demetrius's creepy room and all his vampire stuff. And so, on his own, Pi had become a little bit obsessed. Now, there was a possibility that Demetrius had simply died from some illness in his sleep. Pi had learned that Demetrius had actually been sick a lot before he died, and that he'd worked in a pottery factory that really affected his lungs. So, Pi knew that it was entirely possible that Demetrius had some form of potter's rot, which was a lung disease that a lot of pottery workers got from the bad air in the factory. But potter's rot was like this slow-moving, sort of compounding sickness. It was very progressive, but over a long period of time. And Demetrius apparently had died suddenly. And Pi had spoken to all of Demetrius's neighbors, and they all said, in the time leading up to his death, he wasn't showing any obvious sign of getting sick, or getting sicker, I should say. Like, there was no progression happening. He seemed normal and then was just dead. So that sort of confirmed that potter's rot seemed unlikely. Additionally, when Pi spoke to the neighbors, they also communicated that it didn't seem like Demetrius had any obvious enemies. So the idea that there had been some kind of invisible foul play like poisoning also didn't really make sense. And so, without any other theories to work on, and without the autopsy results yet, Pi had been doing a lot of research on vampires. Now, he was certainly not about to consider that a vampire had killed Demetrius, but the scene of Demetrius's death was just so weird that Pi couldn't get past the feeling that somehow vampires must have had something to do with his death. So far, though, his research really hadn't helped clear that up. But just then, Pi's phone rang, and when he answered it, his heart began to race because it was the coroner. And the coroner said the autopsy was done. And the coroner told Pi that he was never going to believe what that autopsy had discovered. It would turn out Pi had been right. Vampires had everything to do with this death. On the night that Demetrius died, he had done all the things he usually did to keep himself safe before he climbed in bed. But unlike the other nights when he had done this procedure, this night, his routine had not worked. So Demetrius, along with spreading salt all over his room, also put garlic cloves everywhere, since that was one of the most famous ways to ward off vampires, and so he did it every single night. In one of the places, in addition to the floor and the windowsills that Demetrius would put these cloves at night, one of those places was his own mouth. And he'd become really good at keeping that garlic clove under his tongue while he was asleep. But on that night in November, something went wrong. While he slept, the clove slipped out from under his tongue, went down his throat, and got stuck. And during the autopsy, the coroner literally found the clove still stuck there. And so it was determined that he had died from choking on it. So while garlic cloves may have played a role in protecting Demetrius from vampires, unfortunately, it was literally the clove itself that killed him. Our second story is called Bucktooth. One fall afternoon in the late 9th century, a Viking leader named Sigurd Eysteinsson rode his horse across this large field in northeastern Scotland. Riding on either side of him were two of his commanders, and behind the three of them was Sigurd's entire army. This field they were traveling across was about to become a battlefield, and Sigurd and his commanders were riding out to meet the leader of the opposing army who would be taking part in this battle, a horrible buck-toothed man named Mile Brigta. And Mile was actually already in place at the meeting spot, right in the middle of this battlefield. And he was on his horse, and he was flanked on either side by two commanders as well. And then, well behind him was his sea of warriors that would be taking part in this battle. So Mile, he ruled a kingdom called Murray, which was a large area in the north of Scotland. And Sigurd wanted to conquer it. And so today, Sigurd and Mile were meeting in the middle of this really potential battlefield with their respective armies waiting in the wings, behind them. And the idea is they would try to negotiate. Effectively, Sigurd would, basically tell Mile, give me some percentage of your land and we won't, raid your area and try to conquer you. And it was sort of on Mile to determine if that was a worthy thing or not, or if it was better to just stand your ground and fight. Sigurd was not worried because he knew that ultimately he was going to win that fight. Not only did Sigurd's Viking army vastly outnumber the Murray, but Sigurd himself was just far more accomplished on the battlefield than Mile. Sigurd was actually known as Sigurd the Mighty, and he was this famous, fearsome warrior who'd spent the last 2 decades ruthlessly conquering parts of Scotland for his king back in Norway. Mile, on the other hand, was not really feared or respected like that, certainly not by Sigurd. Mile was really known just to be sort of impulsive and kind of untrustworthy, and also definitely kind of dumb. And now, as Sigurd and his commanders arrived in the middle of the field, right in front of Mile and his 2 commanders, and they brought their horses to a halt, Sigurd could now see with his own 2 eyes another thing about Mile that he actually was known for, he was famous for, and that was his 2 giant front teeth that stuck out way over his bottom lip, and actually had earned him a nickname of sorts, which was Mile the Buck-Toothed. And so not long after Sigurd arrived, Sigurd and Mile and the other commanders began their negotiation. But Sigurd quickly realized that Mile was not there to make concessions in order to, find a path to peace. He was actually trying to make demands of the Vikings. Like, he was there telling the Vikings what to do, which is just, in Sigurd's mind, totally ridiculous. I mean, you're outnumbered, you're outclassed, what are you doing? In fact, Sigurd, couldn't believe what was even happening. I mean, as far as he was concerned, Mile was just a nobody, and his demands in some ways were just disrespectful, not real demands. If Mile was smart, he would be begging for mercy here, but obviously he was not smart. And so Sigurd quickly realized that what would have to happen here is he and his Vikings would have to just slaughter his army and seize his lands. And so at some point, while Mile was literally mid-sentence, making whatever demand he was making, Sigurd turned to his 2 commanders and just gave the signal that they were not doing this. They were going to have to fight here. And so Sigurd just grabbed the horse's reins, turned around, and he and his commanders galloped back to his army. And as soon as they got there, Sigurd told his men that they were going to have to massacre all the Murray. But they needed to save Mile the Buck-Toothed for him. Hours later, Sigurd was still on his horse, but this time he was leading what remained of his victorious Viking army down this dirt road away from the battlefield and back towards their camp. Sigurd, like basically all of his men, was totally exhausted, but he was also full of adrenaline because the battle was over and it had gone exactly the way he knew it would. His soldiers had completely destroyed Mile and his army, and he, Sigurd, had personally killed Mile. And so now, as Sigurd rode along here, he looked down at Mile's severed head, which he himself had removed from his adversary's body, and then he had attached the head to his saddle. He looked down at the head, and the head's dangling near his legs, and Mile's eyes are wide open and looking vacantly up at Sigurd, and his mouth was wide open as well, which only sort of made his front teeth look even bigger and hang out even more. And as Sigurd gazed down at this head, he couldn't help but smile as a wave of just pure satisfaction washed over him. During their pre-battle negotiations, Mile had just been unbearably annoying and sort of offensive. And so Sigurd was thrilled he'd gotten the best of him and now had his head dangling right near his legs. That is just perfect for Sigurd. And now that Mile the Buck-Toothed was dead, Sigurd was one step closer to conquering all of Scotland. So he gave out this loud, triumphant war cry, and his men answered him with cheers. Then Sigurd spurred his horse into a full gallop. However, just a few days later, everything had changed for Sigurd. By this point, Sigurd was now laying under a wool blanket in this stone shack in one of his Scottish settlements, and he was screaming in pain. Because over the last couple of days, he'd gotten incredibly sick, and now he was delirious, and he had such a bad fever that he was both covered in sweat and also shivering nonstop. And then at some point, the doctor who had been taking care of Sigurd came into the shack to check on him, and after looking him over, the doctor just shook his head and told Sigurd that he had done all he could, but this sickness, whatever it was going to kill him. And Sigurd, when he heard this, he felt nothing but rage. Not because he was dying, but because he knew that he'd actually been very wrong. He had not gotten the best of Mile the Buck-Toothed. Mile the Buck-Toothed had clearly gotten the best of him. So it would turn out, after the big battle, after, Sigurd had won so triumphantly, as he was riding along, carrying along with him the head of his adversary, Mile's severed head, well, as he began galloping faster and faster, and he's cheering for his men, they're so triumphant, and everyone's cheering along, as he's going faster and faster, the head, the severed head, began bouncing, because of the movement. And remember, Miles got those big 2 front teeth. He's got a nickname, Mile the Buck-Toothed, for a reason. Well, those teeth, as the head jostled around, began puncturing Sigurd's thigh. And he didn't notice it because he was so jacked up on adrenaline. He's galloping off, he's looking down, he sees blood all over his legs, and he's thinking it's gotta be Miles' blood from the fact that his head's been cut off. But no, it was actually Sigurd's blood from the punctures from Miles' buck teeth. And so in the end, even though Sigurd did, successfully kill Mile, he won the battle, well, it would turn out that Mile wasn't done with Sigurd, because Mile ultimately caused Sigurd's death because those punctures got horribly infected. There was no antibiotics to cure the infection, and ultimately Sigurd died. Our third and final story is called Paying the Toll. Around 2 p.m. on July 11, 1978, a man named Francisco Imbernon Valena drove down a highway a few miles outside of the coastal town of La Rapita, Spain. Earlier, Francisco had left the warehouse where he worked, and he was now driving back toward the city where he lived. And so far, this drive had been very uncomfortable and sweaty since it was really hot out today, and he didn't have air conditioning. And also, he was just very annoyed. Because before he had left the warehouse, he'd gotten into a disagreement with another employee. So Francisco was in his 50s, and he had been doing his job for years. And while for sure he was a bit of a curmudgeon about certain things, he was also really experienced and self-sufficient. But for some reason, this other younger guy, this coworker of his who worked in a completely different department, had felt the need to micromanage him and start telling Francisco how to do his job. And he'd even had the audacity to tell Francisco that if he didn't listen to him, listen to this criticism and change your behavior, if you don't do that, you're gonna regret it. Needless to say, Francisco did not appreciate being told how to do his job, especially by some young idiot here. And so in the moment, during their confrontation, Francisco had simply ignored the other employee and kept doing his work. But in reality, the whole thing had really bothered him. And even now, as he drove down the highway, it was all he was thinking about. He was just totally stewing over what this guy told him. Up ahead, Francisco noticed a sign that said a few toll booths were coming up. And now Francisco felt a whole new wave of irritation about these stupid tolls. He thought they were a complete ripoff. And so he made a point to never pay them if he could help it. And luckily for Francisco, on this particular route, he did know a way around these tolls. It was a back route that did take a bit longer, but it saved him money. Plus, it ran right by the ocean, so it was very scenic. And so at the next exit, he pulled off the highway and began taking this long cut. About half an hour later, around 2:30 p.m., Francisco drove down a narrow road that ran right along the ocean. And as he did this, Francisco, if this was even possible by this point, felt even more annoyed. He had been hoping by the time he got down here that there would be some kind of sea breeze to cool him down because there was no AC in the truck. But it was somehow, despite being near the ocean here, it was somehow even hotter than when he had been out on the highway. Just up ahead, there was this very popular campground called Los Alfaques. It was this expansive field right next to the beach that was full of camper vans and tents, and there were also a few businesses like restaurants and a general store that served the grounds. And Francisco saw that this afternoon, the area was absolutely packed. There were hundreds of people just hanging around their campsites and swimming in the ocean. And as Francisco drove past, all he began to think is how great it would be if he could just pull over for a second and take a plunge in the water himself and actually cool off. And so he was letting his mind wander, sort of wishing this ride was less miserable than it had been so far, when an odd sound caught his attention. It was like this metallic groaning sound. And at first, he couldn't even place it. Like, he had no idea what it was, and pretty quickly the sound went away. So he just continued driving along, and then he heard it again. Except this time it was much louder. And this time, Francisco did know what it was, but it was already too late. Just seconds later, people in towns miles away from the campground where Francisco was passing by heard this deafening boom. And from all directions, everyone turned towards Los Alfaques just in time to see this enormous fireball rise into the air like a huge mushroom cloud. It looked like a bomb had literally gone off. But before anybody could make sense of this, there was another explosion, and then another and another. It was like this rapid-fire chain of blasts that boomed over the campground one after another for several minutes. And then finally, when it all went quiet, it was just like flames and smoke and ash just soaring into the sky over this campground and the beach. Within minutes, emergency response units from towns all outside of Los Alfaques descended on the campground to try to figure out what happened and to see if anyone was still alive. But when they actually got there and saw the devastation, like, they couldn't believe it. The scale was almost incomprehensible. There were all these blackened, charred bodies scattered everywhere. They were all contorted from the heat, and some were even still sitting in the remains of camp chairs, like they had been instantly cooked in place when the explosions first began. Now, that was horrifying enough, what they saw up on the field. But what first responders saw down on the beach was even worse, because along the shoreline were bodies of people who had been in the water when whatever happened. And they had clearly been boiled alive. The destruction at this entire site was so complete, so total, that first responders really couldn't even begin to guess what had happened, beyond obviously some kind of explosion. That task of deciphering what happened would take investigators several days, and what they would discover was that it all came back to that fight that Francisco Imbernón-Villena had had with the younger employee before he left the warehouse. So on the day of this catastrophe, it was true that Francisco was on his way back home from the warehouse. He had left work and he was going home. But he wasn't driving a regular truck. It was not a personal truck. And also, he had one stop to make before he could actually go home for good. Francisco was a long-haul truck driver, and he was driving this specialized truck to transport some specialized cargo to its final destination. That cargo was pressurized liquid gas, which is highly flammable and very volatile. So earlier that morning, the younger employee, who Francisco was so upset that he had been micromanaging him, he had worked here for so many years, how dare he? Well, the younger employee had been warning Francisco that Francisco had overfilled his tanker. He had put too much pressurized liquid gas in his truck, which was an incredibly dangerous thing to do if he really had overfilled it, because pressurized liquid gas needs room to expand. And if it doesn't have enough room, it can explode. And that's true on a normal day, but it's even more true, even more dangerous when you're driving this cargo around on a hot day. Because heat, like external heat on the truck, will make that gas expand even more. But Francisco, he just brushed this young employee's warning off. He had years of experience and knew that drivers like him overfilled their trucks all the time. That way they can get more fuel to their destinations. And so he just assumed that, this other employee was overreacting because this never mattered. This never had any impact on anything. They just made more money. And so he just went on with his day. And everything was fine. Nothing happened to the truck until Francisco happened to be driving past that campground. At that point, the heat did cause the gas to expand past the point of no return, and it blew up. And it sent a scorching fireball that was thousands of degrees Fahrenheit through the campground that was full of people. The initial blast was over a mile wide. And that blast triggered a wave of smaller explosions from all the camper vans and the portable grills, basically all the gas cans in that mile radius, those all detonated as well. And so in the end, Francisco, along with 158 other people, largely at that campground, died from the initial explosion. And then some estimates, when you consider long-term disease, long-term health issues from this blast, they put the final death toll at as many as 243 people. At 6 p.m. on Friday, December 17, 2010, a 25-year-old woman named Jo Yates sat drinking and listening to Christmas music at the Bristol Ram pub with some of her co-workers in Bristol, England. Jo, who was a landscape architect, and her co-workers were regulars at this pub. But tonight, they were there specifically to celebrate an early Christmas together. Jo sipped her cider and looked out the window at the falling snow. The sun had just set, and the snowflakes seemed to glow under the streetlights. This, along with the holiday decorations on the shops outside, made the whole street look like the cover of a Christmas card. Jo looked away from the window and joined in on the conversation with her coworkers, who were talking about their various holiday plans. Jo said she was very excited because this was the first Christmas she was going to spend with her boyfriend, Greg Reardon. Greg had gone on a weekend trip, but when he got back, they were going to spend a week with their family and then travel, just the two of them, to Scotland for Hogmanay, which is like a Scottish New Year's celebration. As Jo spoke about Greg, she couldn't help but smile. A few years earlier, she'd been a university student just trying to figure out what she was going to do with her life. And now she had a great job, she had a perfect little flat, and the man that she loved, Greg, had recently started talking about getting married. Life was perfect. At about 8 p.m., so 2 hours after Jo had gotten to the pub, she wished all her coworkers a happy Christmas. She got up from the table, put on her long cream-colored coat, and headed outside into the snow. It was cold, about 27 degrees Fahrenheit, or almost -3 degrees Celsius, but Jo was used to the winter weather. She pulled her coat collar up around her neck and started walking home to her flat, which was about a 30-minute walk away. After walking for a while, Jo ducked into a convenience store to grab a frozen pizza, and then after that, she went into a small shop called Bargain Booze and bought 2 bottles of cider. And so now, with her food and drinks in hand, Jo continued the walk home. She knew her flat would feel empty without Greg there, but she was still looking forward to spending a relaxing Friday night with her cider and her pizza, and of course, her cat. A little after 8:45 p.m., Jo finally approached her flat, which was a basement unit in an old stone house. Jo and Greg's landlord, a retired English teacher, lived in the unit right above them. Jo unlocked the outside door that led directly into her flat, and then she walked inside and put her food and drinks on the kitchen counter. She took off her coat and hung it on a hook near the door, slipped off her boots, and then called for her cat. But after calling for him, she didn't hear him clacking across the hardwood floor like she expected. She looked all around the flat, but she couldn't find him anywhere. Jo shook her head and went back to the kitchen. Her and Greg's cat was a bit of an escape artist. He frequently got out. Their landlord had found their cat in his place upstairs several times, and also, the cat had even made it across the small front garden to their next-door neighbor's place before. And so Jo felt confident the cat would come home when he got too cold, and so for now, she just grabbed a cider, cracked it open, and sat down in the front room. And after she'd only taken a couple of sips, she heard a knock on the door. Jo hoped it was her landlord returning her cat, so she got out of her chair, opened the door, and when she saw who was there, she gave a huge smile. On the night of December 19th, so 2 days after Jo had met her coworkers at the pub, her boyfriend Greg got back to their flat after being gone for the weekend. He unlocked the flat door, walked inside, and put his bag down on the floor. He was about to call out for Jo, but he heard a strange sound coming from the kitchen. His and Jo's cat was meowing, but it sounded like the animal was afraid or angry. Greg walked into the kitchen, and he saw the cat pacing back and forth in front of an empty food bowl. This was really strange, because Jo always made sure that bowl was full. And so Greg scooped some cat food out of the bag, dumped it in the cat's bowl, and then walked to the bedroom looking for Jo. However, she wasn't there. Greg figured she must have gone out with friends or something. He had messaged her when he was heading home, and he hadn't heard back yet, but he really hadn't thought much about it. However, when he stepped back into the front room, he actually looked around for the first time, and at this point, he did start to get worried. Greg saw Joe's coat, her boots, and her purse right there in the room. He knew how cold it was, and so Joe would never have left, at least not without her coat, and she definitely would not leave her purse behind. Greg grabbed his phone and called Joe, and as he did, he suddenly felt a chill come over him, because he heard the sound of her phone ringing inside of her coat pocket right in front of him. Now, Greg started to panic. Joe was one of those people who never went anywhere without her phone. And so he immediately dialed 999, the emergency number in the UK, and he told the operator that his girlfriend, Jo Yates, was missing. In the early morning of December 20th, about 4 hours after Greg called 999, Detective Inspector Joe Goff of the Avon and Somerset Police walked into the flat. D.I. Goff had been a police officer for over 20 years, and as such, he'd learned to remain even-keeled in almost every situation. He spoke in a soft, low voice, and the look on his face almost never gave anything away. Goff greeted a few uniformed officers who had arrived before him and walked over to Greg, who was standing in the front room looking frightened. The detective understood why Greg might be upset, but he didn't want to jump to any conclusions. Now, it was clear Greg's girlfriend had not been home when Greg got there, but besides that, the police didn't have a whole lot of information about what was even going on here. And so Goff introduced himself to Greg and asked him when was the last time he spoke to his girlfriend. Greg said that he had seen Jo a couple days earlier before he left town, but he hadn't talked to her since. Goff asked if it was odd that he would go 2 full days without speaking to his girlfriend. But Greg just shook his head and said no. He'd been busy while he was gone, and he figured Jo had been busy too, getting ready for Christmas, so that's why he must have missed her when he'd called. While Goff listened to Greg, he scanned the room. He could see Joe's coat, boots, and purse. Just like Greg, he did think it was strange that Jo would go out and leave all of those things behind. But still, this didn't prove a crime had occurred here. Goff also noticed 2 cider bottles sitting on a small table. One had a couple of sips gone, and the other looked untouched. Goff asked Greg if there was anything about Jo, like physical attributes or places she liked to frequent, that might point police in the right direction as they began this search for her. Greg gave a basic description of Jo. He said she was average height, had short blonde hair, and blue eyes. And he said she'd been hanging out with coworkers the night he left town at a pub called the Bristol Ram. Goff jotted all of this down in his notebook, got details of where Greg had spent the weekend, and then joined a couple of officers in the kitchen. After spending a few hours in the flat, Goff and the other officers had not found anything that stood out to them. There was no sign of forced entry, no sign of a struggle, and at least according to Greg, the front door had been locked when he got home. Goff told his team to speak to the landlord who lived upstairs, and also to Jo's other neighbors, to see if anyone had seen her in the last couple of days. For now, Goff was treating this as a missing persons case that he hoped would have a clear explanation and a happy ending. For all he knew, Jo had just left town without telling her boyfriend. Maybe she was with the person she'd gotten one of those ciders for. And maybe she took a different coat and purse with her and accidentally forgot her phone. I mean, it was just a thought, but either way, Goff felt confident he could retrace Jo's steps from the moment she left the pub and he could find her. Later that day, Goff sat at the station poring over CCTV surveillance footage from locations between the Bristol Ram pub and Jo's flat. Britain has more surveillance cameras per person than almost any other country in the world. This is why Goff felt so confident he'd be able to see exactly where Jo had gone on the last night anybody had heard from her. And he would be right. Using footage from storefront and street cameras, Goff followed Jo's walk out of the pub and through Bristol. Footage from inside the convenience store showed her buying the pizza, and he saw her go into Bargain Booze and walk out with 2 bottles of cider. Goff later picked her up on a street camera in her neighborhood that showed her walking towards her flat. So, it looked like Jo had just gone home after going to the pub. And Goff could see she was wearing the coat and carrying the purse that had been found inside of her flat. However, Goff couldn't find any surveillance footage that showed Joe back on the street after she had gotten home. It was like she had gone inside of her flat and then just vanished. And when the entire day went by without any of Joe's friends or family hearing from her, Goff began to think that Joe very likely did not just ditch her boyfriend and leave town. And so Goff went to meet with Joe's parents, and when he did, he suggested they reach out to the press for some help. On December 21st, 2 days after Greg had reported Joe missing, Joe's parents went on the local news. They said they loved their daughter dearly, and they asked anyone who might have helpful information to please come forward. By the following day, Joe's story had hit the major newspapers in London, and her picture was being shown on TV news programs all throughout the United Kingdom. And soon, the story of the pretty young missing woman had become a public obsession. At 9 a.m. on Christmas morning, so over a week after Joe had gone missing, a couple was walking their dog down a snow-covered street that was about 3 miles away from Joe's flat. All of a sudden, the dog stopped, sniffed the air, and then looked over to the side of the road. The couple glanced in the direction the dog was staring, but all they could see was a stone wall standing several feet high that separated the road they were on from a field filled with trees on the other side. The man tugged on his dog's leash to try to get the dog moving, but his wife told him to actually stop. And then she walked over to the wall and knelt down to see what was there. And when she looked, she saw something bright buried beneath the snow in a pile of leaves. And as she leaned in closer, she screamed. A few minutes later, several police cars came to a stop on the road where the couple and the dog were waiting. Goff got out of his car and walked right past the couple towards that wall. On the ground, he could see part of a brightly colored t-shirt and a frozen blue human arm. Goff put on his gloves, and he was quickly joined by several forensics officers. And together, they carefully dug into the snow and leaves until they revealed the frozen dead body of a young woman. As soon as he saw her, Goff closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He really was almost always unflappable, but seeing something like this, on Christmas of all days, just shattered him. Goff walked away from the body, collected himself, and then he called Joe's parents to tell them he believed he had just found their daughter's body. Later that morning, after the body had been positively identified as Joe's, Goff and several forensics officers stood by the wall, staring down at Joe. Goff wondered if maybe this was just a terrible accident. Maybe Joe had left her flat in a rush without her coat on, slipped on the snowy ground, and suffered some sort of injury that killed her, or that immobilized her and then she died of exposure. And because it had been snowing, her body would have quickly been covered and would have gone unnoticed. As Goff crouched down and searched the area around Joe's body, a few pieces of evidence jumped out at him. Joe was clothed, however, her shirt had been pulled up around her neck, exposing one of her breasts. He also saw bruising on her throat. And so right away, this did not seem like something that would happen from a fall. It looked like something that would happen in a sexual assault. Also, Goff noticed that Joe had on only one sock. But more specifically, he saw the bottom of her bare foot and the bottom of the sock on the other foot were totally clean. There was no dirt, no leaves, or any other sign that she'd been walking around in this area. It was like she'd been dropped here. Goff heard somebody call his name, and he turned to see a forensic biologist crouched down looking at the wall nearby, gesturing to him. Goff joined her, and she immediately pointed to a section of the wall. Goff looked, and he saw there were bloodstains running vertically up this one section of the wall, almost from the very top to the bottom. He looked at the forensic biologist, a bit confused. She told him that these stains were not the kind of blood spatter that would occur from an attack. Instead, these were stains that would have been left when someone tried to lift Joe's bloody body over the wall and failed. Goff stood up and peered over the wall. On the other side was just a big field full of trees. Had someone been able to actually dump Joe's body onto the other side of the wall, meaning had they not failed to get her over, there was no telling how long it would have taken for someone to finally find her. Goff exhaled, and he could see his breath hanging in the air. The way Joe's body had been found, and the bloodstain on the wall, made it pretty clear this was no accident. He now had a murder investigation on his hands. Goff also felt sure that Joe had not been walking along this road when she died, so his first thought was that she had been murdered somewhere else, probably near her flat, and then driven and dumped here. Goff knew the forensics team had a lot of work to do. However, they seemed very optimistic that the snow and the low temperatures had helped preserve the body, and so they hoped they'd be able to find blood or other DNA samples that might lead them to Joe's killer. So Goff left them to it, got in his car, and headed back to the station. Now that he was investigating a murder, he knew where he had to start, with Joe's boyfriend, Greg. That night, so Christmas night, Goff sat across from Greg inside of an interview room, and the young man looked like a total wreck. He told Goff this was supposed to be the first Christmas he and Joe were going to spend together, and he couldn't believe this was happening. However, as upset as Greg was, he was very cooperative throughout the interview. He gave Goff all the details of his weekend trip again, he again told the story of what had happened when he first came home, and he agreed to submit DNA samples. After that, Goff let Greg go. Since Greg was the victim's boyfriend, the detective would not completely cross him off the suspect list. However, Goff had already followed up on Greg's alibi after they met that first time, and it had checked out. Also, because there was no surveillance footage of Joe after she had gone inside of her flat and then disappeared, Goff believed the only person who could have carried out this murder would be somebody who lived basically inside of that building that the flat was in, because that's the only way they would escape being seen on camera going in and out of her place. And because this case was now all over the news, lots of other people in the United Kingdom were beginning to speculate the same thing. The killer must have been inside of that building when Joe went into her flat. But before Goff could even decide what to do about this theory, he got a phone call. On the other end of the line, he heard the sound of an older man's voice who was speaking with a very proper, posh English accent, and this man quickly introduced himself as Chris Jeffries, Joe and Greg's landlord and upstairs neighbor. And Chris told Goff that he had seen the news about the discovery of Joe's body, and he believed he had information that would help. He said on the night Joe went missing, he had seen a few people he did not recognize walking along the side of the house. In the days following this phone call, Goff followed up on the details of Chris's story, and the detective got the feeling that the landlord was not telling him the whole truth. The landlord, Chris, had been aware of the investigation since the moment police showed up after the 999 call. In fact, members of Goff's investigative team had taken a statement from Chris because he owned the building Joe lived in and was her upstairs neighbor. Now it struck Goff that during that initial meeting, Chris had not mentioned these strangers he'd supposedly seen near the house. Chris had also told investigators that on the night Joe went missing, he said he'd spent the entire night at home. However, since that initial conversation, Goff had reviewed additional surveillance footage. And late on the night of December 17th, the last night anyone had seen Joe alive, Goff saw a car on that footage that looked a lot like Chris's car driving across a nearby suspension bridge, indicating he had not been home the whole time. So, on December 30th, 5 days after Joe's body was discovered, Goff met Chris at the police station and escorted him directly to an interview room. Chris had long white hair, and he wore a sports coat and carried this small leather satchel. He sort of looked like an eccentric professor. Goff sat down at a small table across from Chris and asked him how his relationship with Joe had been. Did he have any issues with her? But Chris just shook his head. He said Joe and Greg were a nice couple and good tenants. He said the worst he could say about them was that sometimes their cat got out and found its way upstairs to his place. Goff asked Chris what he'd been doing on the night of December 17th, the night that Joe went missing. Chris immediately looked confused. He said he'd been home the whole night and hadn't seen anything unusual, just like he'd already told police. Now, Goff didn't raise his voice or even change his facial expression, but he said to Chris, "Hey, that's not true." Chris had called and said on the phone that he had noticed some unusual strangers walking by the house. And so we asked Chris, why hadn't he told the police about those people when they first spoke to him? Now, a worried look came across Chris's face. He said he had only come here to help, but now it felt like he was being accused of something. But Goff just asked him again, why hadn't he told the police about the people he saw by the house? Chris kind of shook it off. He said it was the holidays and people in the neighborhood were having parties, so it didn't seem strange to him at the time that people were walking by the house. For a minute, there was just silence between the two men. And then Goff finally said, on December 17th, surveillance cameras had caught a car that looked just like Chris's car driving across the suspension bridge that was the main route between Joe's flat and the location where her body was found. Chris looked totally stunned. He said there had to be a mistake. He never left his flat that night. It was too dangerous, it was snowing and the roads were bad, so he didn't want to leave his house. At this point, Goff just excused himself and walked out of the room. In all honesty, he really didn't know if Chris was guilty. Chris had easy access to Joe's flat, and that car on the surveillance footage could possibly be his. This was just too much to ignore, and so Goff needed a bit more time to fully dig into Chris's background and his seemingly flimsy alibi. Under British law, in the case of serious crimes like murder, police can apply to a magistrate to hold potential suspects for 36 hours without charging them. Goff felt confident a magistrate would allow him to hold Chris. And Goff was right. That night, police arrested Chris, took a DNA sample, and transferred him to a jail cell in a nearby facility. And for the first time, Goff felt like he had a legitimate suspect. The following morning, which was New Year's Eve, Goff sat at his desk staring at the front pages of multiple tabloid newspapers. Goff was very annoyed, because despite all of his team's efforts to hide it, news about Chris's arrest had gotten out. Goff flipped open one of the papers, and as soon as he did, he got even more upset. The paper had basically decided that Chris had murdered Joe. It was not just that he was arrested, but no, he was the killer. And their proof? Well, just how he looked and how he spoke. However, as upset as Goff was about this, the tabloid headlines actually ended up benefiting his investigation. Because that morning, while Goff waited to secure a search warrant for Chris's flat, he got a phone call. This caller said his name was Vincent Tabak, and he lived in the building right next to Joe's that also happened to be owned by Chris. Vincent said he had seen Chris's car earlier that night facing one direction, and the following morning, Chris's car was facing the opposite direction. When Goff heard this, he started to get excited. If he could prove Chris was lying about staying home on the night Joe went missing, he might be able to definitively link Chris's car to the one he'd seen on the suspension bridge in the surveillance footage. After Goff hung up, he immediately asked a detective on his team to follow up with Vincent to see if he might have seen or heard anything else that night. And then soon after that, Goff got the approval for his search warrant, and so he and his team headed over to Chris's upstairs flat. It was New Year's Eve, and as Goff drove across town, he believed he might actually be able to close this case before people all across the country popped open champagne bottles and welcomed in 2011. When Goff and his team walked inside of Chris's upstairs flat, it felt like they'd stepped into a library. The walls were lined with shelves that were overflowing with old books. Goff told his team to split up and begin their search, and it didn't take long before one of them called out from the kitchen. And so Goff and the other officers walked into the kitchen, and they found that officer sitting on the floor holding something that he'd found tucked under one of the kitchen cabinets. When Goff bent down to get a better look, he thought he was looking at the smoking gun that would wrap this case up, because the officer on the floor was holding a pair of trainers, the British word for tennis shoes, and one of these trainers looked like it was stained with blood. Even the normally calm and collected Goff could not hide his excitement. Between this shoe, the call from the next-door neighbor, and the surveillance footage from the bridge, Goff felt like he was close to having enough evidence to build a strong case against Chris. And so officers bagged the trainer and had it sent off to the crime lab for expedited testing. And by the following day, which was New Year's Day of 2011, the lab came back with the test results.
And on the same day, the lab also reported that they had run tests on DNA samples they'd found on Joe's clothes and skin. And when all these test results came in, Goff knew that they had found Joe's killer. Based on DNA evidence, surveillance footage, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is what police believe happened to Joe Yates on the night of December 17, 2010. Around 8:45 p.m., the killer stood outside of Joe's front door holding her cat. The killer clutched the cat close to their chest so it wouldn't dart off, and then knocked on Joe's door. Joe opened the door, saw the cat, and immediately smiled. She apologized for the cat's behavior and thanked the killer for bringing her cat back. The killer said it was no problem, leaned in through her door and put the cat down, and as the cat trotted off towards Joe's kitchen, the killer lunged at Joe, pushed her further into the front room, and slammed the door behind them. Joe screamed, but the killer immediately covered her mouth while they shoved her through the flat towards the bedroom. Joe tried to fight back, but it was happening so quickly, and the killer threw her onto the bed, pulled her shirt up around her neck, and grabbed at her chest. Joe struggled, and one of her socks fell off in the fight. The killer tried to keep her pinned down, but Joe let out this loud scream, desperately hoping somebody would hear her and save her. The killer panicked and punched her in the face. Blood ran down Joe's cheeks. Then the killer just wrapped their hands around Joe's throat and squeezed. They sat on top of Joe, strangling her violently for over 20 seconds until Joe stopped breathing and died. The killer got off the bed and walked to the front room. They could hear the cat walking around in the kitchen, but other than that, there wasn't any noise coming from the outside. The killer took a steadying breath, hoping they had somehow managed to keep Joe quiet enough to not get detected. And so the killer just sort of stood there for a long time, listening and planning their next move. About an hour after the killer had arrived at Joe's, they went back into the bedroom, picked up Joe, and carried her to the front door. With Joe in their arms, the killer opened the door, quickly locked it from the inside, then they stepped outside and closed the door behind them. Then they rushed to their car, opened up the trunk, and dropped Joe's body inside. Then the killer got in their car and sped across town in the snow. When they reached a dark, empty road with a wall running alongside it, they pulled over and got out. They scanned the street and saw nobody was nearby, so they carefully opened up the trunk, picked Joe up, and carried her over to the side of the road near the wall. The killer tried to lift Joe's body over the wall, but they just couldn't do it. She was too heavy. And so her body slid down the wall, leaving bloodstains on the wall from her face and neck. Finally, the killer just dropped Joe onto the snowy ground. They piled more snow and leaves on top of her, and then ran back to their car and drove off. A few minutes later, they stepped back inside of their flat, hoping nobody had seen what they just did. Despite what some people in the media had already decided, Joe's landlord, Chris Jeffries, had nothing to do with Joe's murder. It would turn out Joe's next-door neighbor, Vincent Tabak, had killed her. Vincent was the one who had called police to say he believed that Chris, who also happened to be his landlord, had driven off in his car on the night Joe was killed, that he was lying about being in his flat the whole time. Vincent had called police after reading about Chris's arrest in the tabloid newspapers. He thought it was a great opportunity to distance himself from the crime and solidify the police's belief that Chris was the killer. Now, when Goff spoke to Vincent, he learned that Vincent was in the Netherlands celebrating Christmas, meaning he was not home. Now, this didn't mean he was guilty, but it struck Goff as just a little bit suspicious, and so he wanted to follow up with Vincent. So Goff contacted authorities in the Netherlands, and then Goff sent a detective from his team out to the Netherlands to meet with Vincent in person. Now, the interview itself did not provide any new information. However, the detective was able to get Vincent to submit a DNA sample. When the test results for the trainers that had been found in Chris's flat came in from the crime lab, it would turn out that even though there might have been blood on them, there was no connection to the murder at all. However, the DNA samples taken from Joe's body and clothes that the crime lab had just tested as well did match the sample that Vincent had provided. After these results, Goff went back to the surveillance footage of the suspension bridge that was near the road where Joe's body had been found. The car in that footage was not Chris's after all, and police would soon discover that Vincent had taken a different, less direct route to the road, which is why he was never seen on camera. Goff secured a warrant, and he and his team searched Vincent's apartment. While they didn't find any specific evidence pertaining to the crime there, Vincent had been watching violent pornography on his computer, most of which featured men assaulting women and strangling them. After police arrested Vincent, they would learn that he didn't really have any real relationship with Joe. He had just seen her around the neighborhood and thought she was pretty. He had also brought her cat back to her in the past. But over time, Vincent developed a violent obsession with Joe. He wanted to have sex with her and strangle her. And as Christmas of 2010 approached, Vincent decided he didn't want to wait any longer to act on this obsession. And when he saw Joe's cat outside on December 17th, he saw his opportunity. Vincent showed up at Joe's flat, returned her cat, and then killed her. Vincent was found guilty of murder and was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 20 years. As for Joe's landlord, Chris Jeffries, who was all but proclaimed guilty in much of the UK media, he's spoken at length in interviews, telling his side of the story and saying how all he had wanted to do was help the police solve a horrible crime.
At about 2:30 a.m. on August 27, 2010, a 29-year-old man named Christopher Kaiser and his girlfriend Emily held hands and stepped out onto a railroad bridge high above the ground in a remote area of North Carolina. It was totally dark out except for the beams of their flashlights. Christopher and Emily were only 15 minutes away from the big event that they had come out here to witness, and they were nervous and excited. They checked the time, then started walking slowly across the bridge, pausing every few feet to listen for the sound of a train rumbling toward them. But all they could hear was whispering and giggling and the occasional shout coming from the 10 other people who had all hiked out here as well to wait alongside them, and who were now just standing in clusters all along the bridge. So usually, this railroad bridge, which was called the Boston Bridge, was not a place that people went to. First of all, it was technically trespassing to be there, but beyond that, the bridge was way out in the woods and required a rocky hike to get to. And once you did get to it, there really wasn't much to see. The bridge itself was pretty basic as bridges go. It had been built in the 1850s out of brick and stone with big arches underneath, and it crossed a ravine that was about 100 feet deep. Train tracks ran the entire length of the bridge, which was about 300 feet. On either end, the tracks disappeared into the forest. And so the Boston Bridge was just a kind of boring, typical railroad bridge with no people on it, except one night a year. And that night was tonight, because tonight the Boston Bridge was supposed to be haunted. Exactly 119 years earlier, on August 27, 1891, a passenger train had somehow lost control while crossing this bridge, and it careened off the side, plunging into the ravine below. The accident had killed 23 people. Now, Christopher and Emily knew that regular trains had not used this bridge in a long time. But ever since the accident, legend had it that if you went to the bridge on the anniversary of that crash, at the exact moment the train went off the side, apparently a ghost train would appear, speeding along the tracks and blasting its horn. People said you could actually hear the horrible screeching sound of the brakes as they tried and failed to keep the train on the tracks, and then you could hear the screaming of the passengers as they plunged to their deaths all over again. This ghost train passing through was the big event that Christopher and Emily and everybody else had come out to see. Tonight, they were all ghost hunters. Just then, one of the people at the bridge checked the time and called out that there was only 1 minute left to go till the ghost train arrived. And with this, all the whispering and laughing and yelling stopped. Everyone on the bridge fell silent and waited. Out on the tracks, Christopher and Emily looked at each other and squeezed each other's hands.
The couple was deeply in love and considered each other soulmates. And one of the best things about their relationship was the sense of adventure they both shared. And tonight was exactly the kind of adrenaline-pumping thing they both loved doing together. And so as the clock ticked down, the couple turned to watch the tracks where they emerged from the woods in the direction they knew the ghost train was supposed to come from. And as they did this, they actually began to feel the bridge tremble under their feet. And at the same time, they heard a few people start shouting with excitement. It was really happening. From the woods came a low rumbling sound that quickly turned into a roar. And for a second, Christopher and Emily couldn't believe it. Of course, they wanted to see the ghost train. That's why they were there. But they hadn't truly been convinced this ghost train was actually real. But now, as they watched, a bright light emerged from the woods and flooded the bridge. The ghost train was almost right on top of them. Suddenly, the train blasted its horn, and then Christopher and Emily heard the screeching of the brakes, just like the legend said they would. But this was not fun and spooky. This was actually terrifying. The other ghost hunters on the bridge started screaming and running, and so did Christopher and Emily. But suddenly, Christopher just stopped running and turned to Emily, and he looked her in the eyes and told her, "I love you." And then Christopher pushed Emily off the bridge. Not long afterwards, police and paramedics flooded the woods around Bastion Bridge and the ravine beneath it. A helicopter circled overhead, shining a bright light down to help them search. And it didn't take long before one of the policemen working his way down the slope that led to the ravine stopped cold and called out for help. He had found Emily. She was badly injured and barely able to move, but she was alive. The police officer looked up at the bridge over his head. He figured she must have fallen 30 feet or so. It was incredible that she had not died. As paramedics strapped Emily into a neck brace to get her safely on a stretcher, another police officer down in the bottom of the ravine shouted that he needed backup now. That officer had found Christopher. It would take some time, but the first responders would eventually piece together what had happened on the Bastion Bridge in the early hours of August 27, 2010. At around 2:45 a.m., members of the ghost hunting group waiting on the bridge had begun to cheer. They saw a bright light approaching the bridge, and they knew this meant the ghost train had arrived. But just seconds later, those cheers turned into screams. Christopher saw everybody else scattering to get away from the bridge, and suddenly he knew exactly what was happening. Passenger trains hadn't used these tracks in decades, but freight trains still did. And by some bizarre chance, one of those freight trains came barreling onto the bridge at the exact time when everybody thought the ghost train would appear. On that freight train, the conductor frantically blew the horn and tried to bring the train to a stop. But Christopher could tell the train was going too fast, and there was no way it could stop in time. And so Christopher and Emily, they started running away from the train down the bridge like the others were, but Christopher saw Emily was lagging behind. And Christopher knew he might be able to outrun this train and get off in time, but from the looks of it, Emily, the love of his life, was not going to be able to do that. And so Christopher made a terrible decision. He took a quick look down to make sure his desperate plan made sense. Then he stopped running, waiting for Emily to catch up with him. He looked her in the eyes, told her he loved her, and then he pushed her off the bridge. Christopher could see that where they were standing was only about 30 feet above the ravine, not 100. And so he figured by pushing her off the bridge, she had a better chance of surviving a 30-foot fall than of being hit by a speeding freight train. However, what Christopher must have understood was that by waiting for Emily and pushing her off to try to save her life, it would not leave him enough time to save his own life. And he was right. Almost instantly after he saved his girlfriend's life, the freight train struck him and threw him off the bridge. When the police officer found Christopher a short while later, he was already deceased. As for Emily, she was airlifted to a nearby hospital, and she eventually recovered from her injuries. And so Christopher is remembered as a hero. One night in the early 1940s, in a small town in eastern Kentucky, a highly respected local man named Arthur Lewis silently made his way down a dark road. Everybody who knew Arthur, and that was most people in this small town, knew him as an upstanding, law-abiding citizen. But tonight, Arthur clutched a hammer and a chisel in his hands and crept as slowly and quietly as he could because he didn't want anybody to know what he was doing. The moon and stars cast an eerie glow across the town. Arthur was not a superstitious person. In fact, he was pretty much the opposite. But the way the moonlight hit the trees along the road made it look like something was moving in the shadows, and Arthur couldn't help but feel creeped out. Still, the moon and stars provided the perfect amount of light for Arthur to see where he was going without being seen. So he took a breath, collected himself, and moved quickly through the shadows on the road. After walking for a few minutes, he turned onto another dirt road that led to the top of a small hill that was ringed by trees. There were a few old wooden houses along this dirt road, and Arthur saw lights on inside a couple of them. So he crouched down a little bit more to try to hide himself in the dark and picked up his pace. Arthur stopped when he reached the top of the hill. A wrought iron gate and fence stood in his path, and there was a thick metal chain with a lock on it wrapped around the gate. Arthur scanned the darkness all around him and took another steadying breath. He knew everybody in town would think what he was about to do was crazy, because this land belonged to a man named Carl Pruitt, and Carl Pruitt was dangerous. But tonight, Arthur didn't care. He was on a mission. Arthur pulled on the gate, but the chain and lock kept it closed tight. So he walked a couple of feet away from the gate and just tossed his hammer and chisel over the fence, which was only a few feet tall. And so Arthur grabbed onto the thin wrought iron bars that made up this fence, and very carefully he climbed up and leapt over to the other side. When he landed, he scooped up his hammer and chisel and walked through some overgrown grass. Now, despite having the hammer and chisel, Arthur did not come to this place in order to work. Instead, he came here to vandalize the place. He had come here really to prove a point. He wanted to show the people in town that Carl Pruitt was not as powerful as they all thought, and they didn't have to live in fear of him any longer. Just then, Arthur spotted the engraved stone marker he was looking for, a marker that declared in capital letters that this patch of land was Carl's. So he gripped his chisel tightly and walked towards the marker. But just as he drew close to the marker and raised his tools to strike, Arthur suddenly froze. He couldn't tell if the moon and stars were playing tricks on him, but it looked like a shadow of a large chain had appeared on the ground in front of him. Arthur instinctively turned around, but he saw he was way too far away from the gate for the chain on it to be casting a shadow all the way over here. However, when Arthur turned back around, the shadow of the chain was now gone. Arthur was shaken up, but he kind of laughed at himself and shook it off. Things always seemed to look strange in the dark. And so Arthur placed the metal blade of the chisel directly on the stone marker and then slammed the hammer into the back of the chisel. A piece of the stone flew off and fell to the ground, and right away Arthur forgot all about that weird shadow he'd just seen. And instead, he just continued chipping away as fast as he could. He knew the noise he was making could attract attention from the people who lived nearby, and he had no intention of getting caught tonight. But just then, Arthur heard a sound over all the noise he was making, and it sounded like footsteps, exactly what he'd been trying to avoid. Arthur stopped hammering and crouched down a few feet away from the stone marker, trying his best to hide. But as Arthur looked around in the darkness, he didn't see anyone. And eventually, the footstep sounds disappeared, at which point Arthur told himself it must have just been the wind blowing through the trees or something, and a bit apprehensively, he got back to work with his hammer and chisel. But suddenly, the sound of the footsteps came back, and this time they were so much louder and they seemed much closer. Whoever it was, they were clearly making their way towards Arthur. And so Arthur had no idea if it was someone from one of the nearby houses or if a local cop had shown up or something, but either way, he wasn't sticking around to find out. And so he turned around to make a run for it when he froze, because something was standing right in front of him, blocking his way. Arthur began to shake with fear, and then without thinking, he dropped the hammer and chisel and took off running. Minutes later, in a house located about halfway down the road from where Arthur was, a man was sitting in his front room when he heard a blood-curdling scream coming from the top of the nearby hill that belonged to Carl Pruitt. The man just froze for a second. The sound frightened him, but it also confused him, because people just did not go up to the top of that hill anymore. But in the eerie silence that followed that scream, this man sort of snapped out of his confusion and shouted for his wife to stay inside, and then he ran to the kitchen and found his flashlight. The man stepped outside, flashlight in hand, and ran to the dirt road that led up to the top of the hill. And as he did, he saw a beam from another flashlight a couple yards ahead of him. He quickly recognized that it was his neighbor, so he called out to him. The neighbor turned around and walked a few steps back down the road, and the two men quickly exchanged notes about the scream they had heard. And then, together, they rushed towards the top of the hill. Once they got there, they arrived in front of the wrought iron gate, and when they shined their flashlights through it onto the ground, they saw something lying just on the other side of the gate. They both just stared at the ground for a few seconds in silence, transfixed by how gruesome the scene was. Finally, one of the two men said he'd go get help, and then he turned and ran back down the hill and headed straight into town. A little later that night, the man who had gone to get help returned to the top of the hill to the gate, now with a police officer. The neighbor who'd been there before hadn't moved. All three men lifted their flashlights and shined them on the ground just beyond the gate. And together, they all stared at the dead body of Arthur Lewis. The metal chain that had been used to keep the gate locked had been removed and was wrapped around Arthur's neck, and Arthur's face had turned a sickly bluish gray. The three men looked up from the body, and they all just nodded to each other. In most circumstances, the discovery of a dead body like this would cause shock and alarm. But these three men felt nothing but resignation and sorrow. They weren't surprised, panicked, or afraid, because they already knew exactly what had happened. Everybody in town knew the kind of violence Carl Pruitt was capable of. This is why most people in town would never have set foot on the piece of land where Arthur had gone, and why they would definitely never have vandalized something that belonged to Carl. And this was because of the horrific chain of events that began back in 1938, a few years before Arthur made his fateful trip up the hill. Back in 1938, late one afternoon, Carl Pruitt had finished a hard day's work in town as a carpenter and headed home. Like most people in this small town, Carl knew pretty much everybody and seemed to get along well with his friends and neighbors. Most days, he worked hard building and repairing things for other people, and then when he got home, he would often find his wife cooking dinner for both of them. But today, when Carl arrived home, he didn't smell anything cooking, and he didn't see his wife in the kitchen. Instead, he heard a strange noise coming from his bedroom at the back of the house. He ran there to make sure his wife was okay, but when he stepped into the room, he found his wife in bed with another man. Carl began to scream, and the other man leapt out of the bed, climbed through the window, and fled across town. As for Carl's wife, she just stayed in the bed, covering herself with a blanket and trying to apologize to her husband and trying to get him to calm down. But Carl, filled with rage, grabbed a metal chain he used on his job, leapt on top of his wife, wrapped the chain around her throat, and strangled her to death. After the murder of his wife, no one in town ever heard from Carl again. Even though there had never been an arrest or trial, the townspeople were glad Carl was gone. They tried to quickly put this horrific event behind them and basically stopped thinking about Carl Pruitt. However, within months of this murder, a series of violent deaths began taking place in town, and most people did not think these deaths were accidents. The first death that caught people's attention involved a young man who had been seen happily riding his bicycle towards the dirt road that led to the top of the hill. But later that day, someone found the boy back in town lying dead on the street, strangled with his own bike chain. Days later, after the boy had been buried, neighbors found his mother dead in her own yard. She also had been strangled, but with a clothesline, while she was out hanging up laundry. These two deaths put the whole town on edge. Even though nobody had seen him, many people suspected that Carl Pruitt must have come back because the boy and his mother had been strangled to death, just like Carl's wife had been. And not long after that, a farmer turned up, strangled with the reins from his own horse-drawn wagon, which prompted a police investigation. However, before he could finish it, that police officer was strangled to death as well, found in an open field with a large chain wrapped around his neck, looking like it had almost decapitated him. After the death of this police officer, combined with all the other strange strangulation deaths, the town had had it, they were terrified, and they went into full panic mode. Soon, stories began to surface that people had seen Carl wandering through the shadows on this small patch of land he owned on the top of the hill, just waiting for his next victim. And now, Carl appeared to have found his next victim. Arthur Lewis, the man who said he wasn't afraid of Carl, who had traveled up the hill with his hammer and chisel. On top of the hill, the officer and the two men who'd found Arthur's body stood at the gate. The officer told the men to step back and wait over there. Once they had, he opened the gate, walked through, and stepped directly over Arthur's body. He made his way through the grass and found Arthur's hammer and chisel on the ground. And right next to them was the engraved marker that Arthur had come out to deface. However, when the officer shined his light on the marker had no damage to it whatsoever. It was completely intact. Not a single piece of the stone had been chipped off by the chisel. The officer crouched down and moved his light over the stone, and he saw very clearly that on this stone were the words Carl Pruitt, and next to it were dates, the date Carl was born and the date Carl died. Because this stone marker that Arthur had come up here to deface was actually Carl's gravestone. Because Carl had died back in 1938 on the day he found his wife in bed with another man. It would turn out Carl Pruitt not only killed his own wife, but also after seeing what he had done, seeing her dead body, he grabbed a pistol, put it to his head, and fired, taking his own life. Soon after the murder-suicide, Carl's wife was laid to rest in the cemetery near her church, but her family demanded that Carl be buried somewhere else. And so Carl was buried in an isolated grave in an old cemetery at the top of that hill. And of course, since the man was dead, everybody in town assumed he was gone for good, and they would never have to deal with Carl again. But that all changed not long after Carl was buried, when people in town reported seeing strange shadows around his gravesite. And these shadows always took on the same form: a large chain like the one Carl had used to murder his wife. The story spread, and soon a morbid curiosity about Carl's grave arose in town. And that's around the same time that the other strangling deaths began, and when people started to claim that maybe Carl's ghost was responsible for them. But being strangled was not the only thing that connected all these victims. It would turn out, not long before their deaths, they had all tried to vandalize Carl Pruitt's grave. Some had done it on a dare, others did it out of anger. As for the police officer who eventually launched this investigation following all these strangling deaths, well, he didn't vandalize Carl Pruitt's grave, but he was so intrigued by the idea that Carl's ghost could be responsible that he went to the gravesite and began taking photographs. And it was not long after that he died. As for Arthur, he did attempt to vandalize the grave, But he was not doing it out of anger or some vendetta against Carl or Adair. He was actually doing it to prove to the rest of the townspeople that there was no such thing as ghosts, and that Carl Pruitt was dead and could no longer hurt anyone. However, the instant Arthur began to deface that headstone, someone or something strangled him to death, and many people believe it was Carl Pruitt's ghost. And despite all those attempts at defacing Carl Pruitt's headstone, that headstone was always found, at least according to local legend, in perfect condition. Following the discovery of Arthur's body, people in town really began to fear Carl Pruitt's ghost and his cursed headstone, and they demanded that the cemetery on the hill be closed. And so family members with loved ones buried up there had their bodies removed and reburied in other cemeteries. However, nobody dared touch Carl's grave. So Carl's body remained in that cemetery until 1958, so 20 years after he had killed his wife and taken his own life. At that time, in 1958, a strip mining company dug up the ground on the hill, destroying Carl's body and his headstone, and so the curse was said to have finally been lifted. And so, if these two stories tell us anything, it's that if you think you can go searching for ghosts without consequences, you can't.
On March 4th, 1946, nearly every resident of a rural Brazilian town called Araçariguama packed up a few days' worth of food and drink and headed south to the nearest big city to celebrate the Festival of Carnaval. This festival is an opportunity for folks to cut loose and eat good food right before most of them go into a religious fasting period. One resident who opted not to join the fun at this festival was a 44-year-old man named João Prestige Filho. João was a farmer, he had 5 kids, he was a very quiet guy, and he did not enjoy things like the festival for Carnival. The crowds and the noise made him anxious, and he really hated dancing, which there was a lot of at these festivals. Instead, João would rather spend his spare time out in nature. And so, when João's friends and family and everybody else disappeared to head off to this festival, João did just that. He and his best friend packed up João's horse and cart, and they traveled across the dirt roads through the woods to the nearby Tietê River, where they spent the day fishing for catfish. And as João stood on the rocks casting out his line, he listened to the birds sing and the parrots swooping by. It was beautiful and sunny out. I mean, this was a perfect day for João. As sunset drew near, though, both João and his best friend knew that while the rainforest they were in was beautiful during the day, at night it could become quite hazardous with the animals that come out at night, and so they knew they needed to leave. And so they packed up all the fish they caught back into João's cart, and then the two of them hopped onto the cart and began making the journey back towards the town of Araçariguama. When the pair got to a split in the road, João's best friend hopped off the cart and walked on foot down one path because his house was actually just outside of the town, and João, still in his cart with his horse, said bye to his friend and went the other direction. Now, by this point, the sun had completely set, and so it was totally dark out as João is going down this dirt road in the final stretch towards his town. At this time, in 1946, Araçariguama was a beautiful place, but by no means a modern place. They had no running water, no electricity, there was no sewage, no paved roads, no access to main roads, and nobody had a telephone. It was basically like this little patch of civilization with about 100 people living there. There was a church in the middle of the town and a couple of small huts that kind of sat around it. And João and his family lived in one of those huts. João usually loved walking along or traveling along this particular stretch of dirt road, especially at night, like he was doing right now. He really enjoyed looking up at the stars and listening to the animals off in the forest that he couldn't see. But this night, João just had a bad feeling as he was making this final approach towards his town. Now remember, there's almost no one in the town. They're all at this festival, so it's kind of like a ghost town in the middle of a forest. But João, as he's going down this dirt road and he can see the church up ahead, he's a couple hundred feet away, he began getting this very unnerving sense that he was being watched. And so João, as he's in his cart, began looking into the trees and all around him, wondering if maybe an animal or a person was nearby.
but there was no one. Finally, Joao actually reached the church, and he could see his little house, and he could also see that his wife, who was at the festival, had opened up one of the windows just slightly so he could open it up the rest of the way and crawl into the house when he was back from fishing, because she had locked the doors when she left. And so by this point, Joao was trying to be very calm and collected despite the stress of feeling like he's being watched. But when he saw that window and he saw how close he was to his house, he basically just had the horse sprint the rest of the way to his home. He just wanted to get off the streets. And so finally, Joao, he reaches his house, he crawls in through the window, he shuts it behind him, and immediately Joao expected to feel totally relieved that he was now behind locked and closed doors and windows. He was safe. But despite being inside of his home, he still had this sense that there was someone or something around him that was watching him. Joao, like many other residents of this village, was fairly superstitious. There was an old abandoned mine that was near the town, and Joao and his peers had grown up hearing stories about some monster that lived in the mine that would come out at night and roam the forest. And older people in this village would talk about this ancient serpent called Boitata that would come out at night, and it would appear in a burst of fire. And so Joao, he's thinking about the mine and these demons and ghosts that roam in the forest, and he's all alone because everyone's at this festival and he doesn't feel safe inside of his house, and so he's really starting to panic. And it's at this moment that he suddenly feels this sense that whatever or whoever has been watching him is right out his window to his left. And so Joao, as he's turning to look out the window, he's anticipating seeing a person out there, or maybe a jaguar or some other animal that's followed him from the rainforest. But when Joao turns and looks out the window into the dark night, what he sees right outside of his property was so terrifying that for a second Joao couldn't even breathe. And he just stood there staring at this thing, and then he tried to put his hands up to protect himself, but it was already too late. Minutes later, Joao would come stumbling out of his front door, out into the dark night. He's got a big blanket wrapped around him, and he was just screaming incoherently. And as he screamed all this nonsense, he began running in this kind of zigzag pattern with no clear destination in mind. It was just like this mindless running all through the village. And as he's running, he's got no shoes on, and he's stepping on sharp rocks and glass and trash. He's cutting his feet up horribly, but he doesn't seem to even notice. And so as he's doing this, he's causing this huge scene, but everybody's gone. It's a ghost town. It's just him in this abandoned village in the middle of a rainforest in Brazil. But eventually, Joao kind of calmed himself down and ran to his sister's house, Marie, because he noticed there was a lamp on inside of her house, and he was hoping that maybe she too had stayed back from the festival. And it would turn out Marie had not gone to the festival. She too did not really like big gatherings like that, and so she was home. And so Marie was in her kitchen when she began hearing outside this horrible screaming sound, almost guttural sounds coming from someone or some animal out there. And then before she could even figure out what it was, she heard this loud thud against her door. Marie was terrified, and she ran to her front window to look out and see what it was that had just collided with her door. And what she saw made no sense. It was her brother, Joao, but he was wrapped in that big blanket and his feet were all bloody, and he was screaming at the top of his lungs, but he wasn't saying anything. He was just kind of babbling. And so Marie was about to run over and open the door for her brother. But right before she did, as she's looking out the window, Joao turned and looked at her, and when he did, she screamed because his eyes looked so alien. They were wide and totally unfocused, and she thought, that can't be my brother. What's wrong with him? But she would go over and open the door because, after all, it is her brother. And so she opens the door. Joao kind of falls into the room and began writhing around on the ground, continuing this scream he was emitting that didn't even seem human. And the whole time, Marie is trying to ask him, what's wrong? What's going on here? She's scanning him, and besides the cuts all over his feet, he didn't appear to have other injuries. And so eventually, Marie just knelt down, and she was about to grab Joao and try to kind of stop him from moving around to just look at him and try to have a conversation with him. But before she grabbed him, Joao rolled over and his lips opened up, exposing his teeth, and he kind of grimaced at her with those wild, unfocused eyes. And again, Marie just kind of backed up in horror. Who is this? What's happened to my brother? And as Marie stood up to get away from Joao, still with that sickening grin with his teeth exposed, had this kind of low hiss come out of his mouth. And so Marie, thinking he was trying to talk, she leaned in, and through this hiss, she heard him repeating, "It burns, it burns." And so Marie, thinking her brother must have been burned, instinctively began removing the blanket and pulling his clothes off to find the source of this burn on her brother. But besides the cuts all over his feet, as she's looking at his body, his skin looked totally normal. He looked completely unhurt. And so Marie turned up to look at Joao's face again to ask him more questions in hopes maybe he could tell her something. And it was at that moment she noticed that even though he didn't seem to have any other injuries, his complexion on his face was now starting to change. Now, Joao's cheeks had turned this kind of dark purple and almost looked like they were starting to swell. And so at this point, Marie knew, okay, I can't handle this. I don't know what's going on here. And so she would stand up and just kind of back away from Joao, who's still got that grimace with his teeth exposed and his purple cheeks. He's staring up at Marie. And Marie, she finally backs out and she goes out the front door and she begins running to the other side of town. Marie knew that there were two other men who had stayed home from this festival. It was the town sheriff and the town doctor, whose name was Arasi Gumiji. And those two men lived close together on the other side of town. And when Marie arrived in front of their homes and began pounding on their doors and yelling for help, the two men quickly came outside, at which point Marie tried to explain what was happening to her brother, but she didn't really have the words, and so she just said, "He needs your help." And so the two men just went with Marie, and they ran back across town to Marie's house, where Joao was still on the ground, writhing in pain when they went inside. Marie had only been gone for a couple of minutes, but by now it wasn't just Joao's cheeks that had turned that purplish color. His chest and arms were also turning purple. At this point, the sheriff leaned over Joao and began asking him some questions, and Joao, he was obviously in horrible pain from something, but by this point he had calmed down enough to where he was speaking a little bit more. But what he was saying made no sense. He told the sheriff that he had been followed home and then he got burned. And when the sheriff asked him, "Who burned you?" all Joao could say was, "No one is to blame." At this point, the sheriff left Marie's house and jogged over to Joao's house to look for some sign of how he got burned. But when he got there, the house was completely unburned. Everything was exactly as it should have been. There was no scorch marks. There was not even a lit candle anywhere. So there was no clues as to what happened to Joao. By the time the sheriff got back to Marie's, it had been about 45 minutes from when Joao first got hurt. And now, whatever was happening to his body that was turning him purple appeared to be getting much worse. Joao's skin all over his face and his chest and his arms was now not only a very dark purple, but his skin was starting to blister and pop. In fact, there was one area on his arm that had bubbled up so much that when it burst, you could actually see the bone in his arm. It was almost like Joao had been boiled in water, like the way you would boil meat on a bone until the meat was tender enough that it fell off the bone. It was like that was happening to Joao. And so as Joao's flesh just sort of began cooking off of him, the town doctor, Arasi, said, "We have to get him to a hospital right now." But because the roads were not paved and it was dangerous traveling at night, they knew they couldn't get him to the big city hospital. They would have to take him to a local hospital. And so the sheriff, who had a truck, said, "Let's just put him in the truck and I will drive him there." And so Arasi, the sheriff, and Marie, they got a new sheet, they wrapped up Joao inside of it, and they brought him outside, they put him in the sheriff's truck, and they began driving towards the hospital. Arasi stayed in the back with Joao as they made this drive, and every time the truck went over a bump, Joao would let out a cry of pain, and Arasi would look over and he would literally see these bumps were causing his skin to kind of fall off of his body. When they finally arrived at the local hospital, the staff there pulled Joao inside, they put him in a private room, they put him on a bed, and they had no idea how to treat him. It was like his injuries looked nothing like they had ever seen. They didn't even know where to begin, and they kind of assumed that Joao would not survive whatever was happening to him. And so the first thing they did is just pumped him full of painkillers. And while these painkillers didn't actually do anything to stop basically Joao's body from decomposing while he was still alive, they did at least allow Joao to stop feeling this horrible pain of his flesh falling off of him. And so Joao finally just kind of sunk back in his bed, and the sight of him must have just been horrific. He literally had huge chunks of his flesh just missing. I mean, literally parts of his skeleton were exposed to the naked eye. After the doctors had gotten Joao as stable as they could get him, Arasi, the local town doctor, sat down next to Joao and just began asking him questions. And for the first time, Joao was able to talk somewhat normally because he was on such a high dose of painkillers. And so Arasi began asking Joao to go over everything that happened from the time he left fishing for catfish until he arrived at his house and got burned. This is roughly what Joao told Arasi. He said on his walk home from fishing, he started getting that feeling that he was being watched, and it got more and more intense as he got into town, until finally he basically sprinted the rest of the way to his house, practically dove through that open window, shut it behind him, and expected to feel relief being in his own home again. But he didn't. The feeling only intensified that he was being watched. And at some point, he got that sense that whoever or whatever was watching him was to his left, out the window, out into his yard. And when Joao turned to look, what he saw standing outside was this dark figure kind of hovering over the ground, and it was staring right at Joao. And before Joao could even put his hands up to protect himself from whatever or whoever this was, this figure shot this bright ray of light directly into Joao's home through that window, which hit Joao in the chest and the face. And immediately Joao was blinded and confused by this light, and then it really started to burn. He believed he was on fire, which is why he grabbed that blanket and wrapped it around himself. He was trying to put out a non-existent fire, and that's when he stumbled outside and kind of zigged and zagged, kind of half trying to put this fire out until he arrived at Marie's house. But when he got there, that sensation of feeling like he was on fire didn't go away. It just got worse and worse and worse, and then his skin began falling off. When Arasi asked Joao, who do you think did this to you? Who do you think that figure was? And Joao, with bulging eyes, would sit forward and say to Arasi, "It wasn't of this world." And as Joao said this, a chunk from his cheek fell off, exposing his jaw and teeth. And as this happened, Joao asked one of the nurses for a water. And so Arasi is sitting there having heard the story as Joao, who's all hopped up on painkillers, is grabbing this water and drinking, and Arasi is watching the water dribble out of the hole now on the side of Joao's face. About 4 hours later, Joao would pass away from his injuries. There has never been any official explanation for what actually happened to Joao. The doctors just wrote cardiac arrest and generalized burns on his death certificate because they really had no idea what else to call this. Joao's family believed the Boitata, the ancient serpent that lived in the forest and appeared at night in a ball of fire, was responsible for what happened to Joao. Other people in town thought maybe it was the monsters or demons from the old abandoned mine that had come out and attacked Joao. Outside of Joao's town, people have theorized that Joao must have been subjected to some really high dose of radiation, and so this theory has led people to believe that, perhaps Joao was the victim of a secret weapon that the government was testing. But to create such a concentrated beam of radiation that only affects Joao would be way more technologically advanced than anything that was available at the time in the world. Not to mention, why would any government randomly target a Brazilian farmer with this weapon? But Joao would not be the only person in Brazil to die from mysterious rays of light. In the 1970s, so 30 years after Joao's death, several people in a city in northern Brazil reported seeing bright lights coming down from the sky, and then they too began turning purple and their skin began falling off and they would die. And so because of this high number of very strange deaths that looked just like Joao's, a new theory has taken root over the years to explain what happened to Joao and these people. and that is they were attacked by a UFO. That Joel, when he looked out the window and saw that dark figure hovering over the ground, that was a UFO, and the light he saw was a weapon. The UFO was firing a ray of radiation that struck him and killed him like it struck and killed the others in Brazil. The military actually looked into this theory in 1977 and 1978. It was called Operation Saucer, like flying saucer. However, officially, they came out and said they found no evidence that UFOs were in any way involved in what happened to Joao or these other people. However, many people are skeptical that we're really getting the truth.
During World War II, the Soviet Union began investing heavily into nuclear power, and by 1977, the V.I. Lenin nuclear power station located in Chernobyl, Ukraine, was finally operational. The station itself was comprised of 4 reactors that were each labeled 1, 2, 3, and 4. On April 25, 1986, a group of very sleep-deprived plant workers began running a series of routine tests on nuclear reactor number 4. They were trying to see if the reactor could still be cooled even in the event of a complete power loss. But during the test, perhaps because they were sleep-deprived and just didn't feel like doing it, they started cutting corners and violated a number of safety protocols that led to several surges of power inside of the reactor. This led to a chain reaction of explosions within reactor number 4 that culminated in a massive explosion that blew the lid off the building, exposing the reactor's core. It would take the Soviets 10 days to finally stop the fire that was raging inside of this exposed core, which meant for those 10 days, radiation on an unprecedented level was spewed into the environment by this fire. But even after the fire was controlled, you have all this radioactive material that needs to be properly disposed of. And so the Soviets started by using robots to go up and pick up these materials and dispose of them, but the robots were breaking down from the high levels of radiation. And so naturally the Soviets sent in groups of men to go pick up the material, and dozens of people died from radiation sickness. A few months after the explosion, the first steel sarcophagus was built around reactor number 4 to try to contain some of that radiation. But even with that protection, it's estimated that the area around Chernobyl will not be habitable for another 20,000 years. So as a result, the Soviet Union created what they call an exclusion zone, which is 19 miles all around Chernobyl that no one can go inside of. And so nature's kind of reclaimed this area that used to be a fairly bustling metropolis. 1 year after the disaster, Ukrainian containment crews finally broke into the steam corridor that was located underneath the molten remains of reactor number 4. And as soon as they stepped in, their radiation readers spiked all the way to the top. And so they know that whatever's at the other end of this L-shaped hallway is something they did not want to get close to. And so they put a camera on a chair with wheels, and they pushed it down the hall to where it finally broke that corner and had a clear line of sight to the other end. And using a timer on the camera, they were able to take a picture of one of the single most dangerous things in the entire world. It became known as the elephant's foot. It was a molten pile of nuclear fuel and melted metal and sand and concrete that had all kind of converged and seeped through a pipe meant for steam and found its way into the basement. It was and still is emitting the equivalent level of radiation of 4.5 million chest x-rays every hour. Today, if you were to stand in front of the elephant's foot without proper equipment for 30 seconds, your cells would start to hemorrhage and you would become viciously ill, and you could even die. At 2 minutes of exposure, you're definitely going to die. But not right away. You have 48 hours and there's nothing you can do to stop it. You are 100% going to die. On October 31st, 2013, 4 mechanics were performing routine maintenance on a wind turbine in the Netherlands. In the early afternoon, all 4 of them are standing on top of the turbine itself, 2 on one end and 2 on the other, and a small fire breaks out inside of the housing of the turbine, right near where you would go back into the housing. Now, it's unclear what caused the fire, but it's speculated that it was caused by a short circuit. The 2 engineers on this side of the turbine were able to jump over the fire, land in the stairwell, and run their way down to safety. The other 2 on this side had a bad angle and could not make the jump, and so they had to wait until rescue workers showed up to put the fire out. But wind turbines are usually in areas that are very far away from society because they're huge and they're kind of eyesores.
And so the response time was not good. The fire department did not show up very quickly, and by the time they got to the wind turbine, that little fire had gotten much, much bigger and had creeped up onto the platform that they are on. And then when the fire department actually started performing their job, the fire had spread well down the stairwell, and so it was very difficult and took a very long time to make their way up using the stairs. And the crane on the truck itself did not extend high enough to reach them either. The two trapped mechanics are watching this in real time. They're looking down and they can see the fire department is not going to be able to reach us in time because the fire is now spreading and getting bigger and bigger, and they're being pushed to the very edge of this wind turbine with an 80-meter fall to the ground. As the fire inched closer and closer and closer to them, the men must have realized that they have to make a decision here. They can either sit here and wait and hope for some miracle that perhaps a helicopter shows up and scoops them up, or some other mechanism of rescue is able to occur, or they try to make a run for it through the flames on the top of the turbine into the stairwell and just hope that the fire in the stairwell is not as severe and that maybe they can run through it and make it out the other side. Or the final option is to jump off the side and hope you survive the fall. And so as the fire continued to grow and get closer and closer to them, the men embrace one last time, and then one of them makes a run for it through the flames into the stairwell. His charred body would be found right at the landing of the stairs. He did not make it very far. He really had no hope. The last remaining mechanic is standing there wondering what he should do. He's probably looking down in hopes that he's going to see his friend who just ran in there emerge at the bottom on the ground, safe. But he doesn't. And after a considerable amount of time and the fire is getting closer and closer, he knows his friend didn't make it, and probably not wanting to suffer the fate that his friend did, he jumps. This is the picture of the two mechanics embracing for that final time. I'm sure at the time of this picture, they were aware that almost certainly they were not going to get out of this alive. They were 19 and 21 years old. In 2013, Philip Chisholm was a 14-year-old high school student going to school in Danvers, Massachusetts. He lived at home with his single mother. Classmates described Chisholm as being quiet, a bit of a loner. He was a great student, and he was the leading scorer of his soccer team. On October 22nd, 2013, Chisholm missed soccer practice in the afternoon and then missed a team dinner that night, at which point his teammates tried calling and texting him. He didn't get back to them, so they got in touch with his mother. She tried reaching out to him to no avail, and so she contacted the police and said, "My son is missing." On the same night that Chisholm is reported missing, one of his teachers, 24-year-old Colleen Ritzer, doesn't come home from work. Her family and her friends try reaching out to her, texting her, calling her, no response, so they too go to the police and they report her missing as well. The police were already looking for Chisholm, so when they hear one of his teachers is also missing, they assume they must be linked, and so they go to the high school, even though it's well after hours, to see if maybe there's some clues there. They search the high school, and Chisholm is not there, and neither is Miss Ritzer, but when they're looking in the girls' restroom that was right next to Miss Ritzer's classroom, they find a small splash of blood. Even though at the time they had no way of knowing if this blood was connected to Chisholm or Miss Ritzer, they decided they would pull all the security footage for the past 24 hours that was looking in the direction of this bathroom. And they make a startling discovery starting at the 2:54 p.m. mark on October 22nd, the day they went missing. This is Miss Ritzer walking down the hall towards the bathroom that had blood in it. This is Chisholm following Miss Ritzer into the hall. He's looking hesitant. He doesn't really know what he's going to do. He's thinking about following her, and at some point he says, "You know what? I am going to do this." He goes back into the classroom, reemerges with his hood on, and walks down the hall towards the bathroom where Miss Ritzer is. This is Chisholm entering the girls' bathroom with surgical gloves on. 11 minutes later, Chisholm would leave the bathroom. Miss Ritzer would still be inside. Chisholm would leave school property, he would run outside, he would get a big recycling bin, and then he would wheel that back into the school, and then he would go back into the bathroom with the recycling bin. At 3:21 p.m., 26 minutes after Chisholm had first entered the girls' bathroom after Miss Ritzer, he re-emerges now wearing a full face mask. He doesn't have a sweatshirt on anymore, and he's pulling along this recycling bin that looks noticeably heavier than when he brought it in. And that's because Miss Ritzer's body is now stuffed inside of it.
Police were able to locate Miss Ritzer's body using the surveillance cameras on the outside of the school. They just watched what he did with the recycling bin, and he didn't bring it very far away from the school. Police were able to quickly track Chisholm down and arrest him because as soon as he was done attacking Miss Ritzer, he used her credit card to go to a movie theater in town and watched a movie. So he's on security cameras watching the movie, and the police were tracking her credit cards because they noticed they were stolen, and they saw that he had swiped the card at this movie theater. So he gets arrested and he's given a life sentence. Here is the footage of Chisholm leaving the girls' bathroom with Miss Ritzer's body inside of that recycling bin. His motives remain unclear, but he claims she used what he called a trigger word that really upset him. So that's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's stories. Let me know in the comments what you thought, and I will pin the best comment at the top of the comment section. If you haven't done this already, please offer the like button a flimsy plastic outdoor chair, and as soon as they sit down, kick one of the legs out from under them. Also, please subscribe to this.
I'm already drifting with another crowded street. Coffee's gone cold on the 18th floor. Before one sip, my phone rings 3 times more. My calendar stretches like an endless rail. Every empty space has quietly felt. Some days I forget there's a sky outside. Couldn't tell you if it rained or sunlight survives.
Broadcast channel still on. Blue lights glow inside the control room. Data streams run quietly by. The city sleeps inside emotion. Only signals keep me alive. Screens are breathing in soft flickers. A strange line just appeared tonight. No one speaks it out in words yet, but the air's changed. It's like 1 second feels like it stretches out. Even silence turns into alone but in love. Oh God, it's such a pretty view. Driving to your house, you say that we're over, whatever. And yet you're crying out my name until you fall asleep. You're my twilight silhouette. Turn out the sun and stay in bed. The deeper I fall, the higher I go. Your hesitation never slow. You say you're over it. Who do you think you're kidding?
This channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username on both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit. It's just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. I check that every day. If I intentionally use your story suggestion, I will credit you. So whether I see